Well, hey guys, Dermatologist Dr. Whitney Bowe here, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm talking all about dark spots, hyperpigmentation, melasma, what causes those dark spots to form, how we can get them to fade away. The most important thing when it comes to treating dark spots is really to take a step back and understand the steps in the pigment production pathway, because then it'll make sense when you're trying to select products, select ingredients, and really build out a really impactful skincare routine. So that's what I'm gonna go through with you guys today. So for those of you who are new here, I am a practicing board certified dermatologist. I'm also a published research scientist, and I'm the founder and CEO of a skincare brand. So I'm basically obsessed with ingredient selection and product formulation. I would love you guys to subscribe and follow along. Okay, so back to dark spots. So the key player here is gonna be a cell called a melanocyte. Now the melanocyte is a pigment producing cell that actually pumps out a pigment called melanin, and that's what shows up as a dark spot, as a stain on the skin. So it's really important to understand the steps in that pigment production pathway, because that's going to allow us to really target our treatment. And ideally, the best way to treat dark spots is actually to hit it at multiple steps along that pigment production pathway. So there are 3 key steps in the pigment production pathway. Step 1 is there going to be some kind of a stressor, some kind of a trigger, something that tickles and wakes up your melanocytes, makes them feel uncomfortable, and they go into pigment production mode, okay? Step 2 is the actual synthesis or production of that pigment, and that's done through an enzyme called tyrosinase. Now, step 3 is what's called the transfer of pigment. So it's when the melanocyte then sort of takes that pigment and hands it out to all the surrounding cells in the skin called keratinocytes. So let's break that down more closely and look at the specific ingredients and products that might help with each one of those steps. Okay, so the first thing that happens is your melanocytes are sitting there and they're chilling, they're happy, they're relaxed, right? And then they sense a threat. There's something happening in their environment that stresses out your melanocyte. So what can stress out your melanocyte? Sunlight, UV light, visible light from sunlight, pollution, any ingredient that's too irritating, a very drying ingredient, friction, rubbing can stress out your melanocyte. And acne breakout, inflammation can stress out your melanocyte. And what happens is you get these free radicals, this oxidative stress in the environment around the melanocyte, and that tells the melanocyte to go into protective mode. And what does it do? It starts pumping out pigment. So that's step 1. How do you block that first step? Well, when it comes to UV light and pollution, I always recommend starting off your day with a vitamin C antioxidant serum, followed by a sunscreen. I always recommend SPF 30 or higher, and you want to look for the words broad spectrum. I also recommend avoiding anything that's gonna create friction or be too mechanically harsh on the skin. That's why I'm not an advocate of those manual gritty scrubs, and I prefer more gentle exfoliating serums instead. If you want to speed skin cell turnover and you really want to sort of clean out those pores and smooth out the texture of the skin. Here's a list of my favorite ingredients that you can find in skincare. They're going to block step 1 of the pigment production cascade. Orchid extract is a newer ingredient that caught my attention because of this study where it's actually being compared to 3% vitamin C, and they looked at people who had melasma or sunspots, what we call lentigos, and the results were very impressive. Okay, so moving on to step 2, here we have the actual production of the pigment called melanin by the cell called the melanocyte. How does the melanocyte do that? It uses an enzyme called tyrosinase to make the melanin, to make the pigment. So as you can imagine, the way to block step 2 is to basically inhibit or stop that enzyme from working. So those ingredients are called tyrosinase inhibitors. Now, the gold standard for tyrosinase inhibitors is an ingredient called hydroquinone, which I'm sure you've heard of, and it's an ingredient that you have to get as a prescription from your dermatologist. Hydroquinone, you guys, is super powerful, right? It really works, but I don't recommend using it unless you're under the very close supervision of a dermatologist. And that's because if you don't use it the right way, it can actually lead to something called exogenous ochronosis, which is a fancy way of saying that you can get irreversible brown spots, like brown spots that actually won't go away and that are what are called refractory to treatment. So that is no fun when it happens. So I always say, if you're gonna go down the hydroquinone pathway, make sure it's with somebody, a dermatologist that you know and you trust, who's looking at your skin every couple of months at least. Let's look at some of my favorite ingredients that block step 2 of the pigment production pathway. So first of all, you might see something called vitamin F. Vitamin F refers to a combination of linoleic and linolenic acid. Those are both excellent when it comes to blocking this step. And then another one of my favorites is Tranexamic Acid. And that's an ingredient that's near and dear to my heart because I actually prescribe it as a pill to some of my patients who have melasma in the office, really treatment resistant, stubborn melasma. There are certain patients who are good candidates for that oral medication. And I find it can be very effective, both orally as well as in certain cases, if it's formulated well, topically as well. The observant ones of you might notice that there are certain ingredients that were actually in both the list for blocking step 1 and this list for blocking step 2. For example, green tea, licorice, and that's because there are some compounds within those ingredients that can both act as antioxidants. They can neutralize free radicals for the step 1, but they can also inhibit tyrosinase. And I'll just list a couple of really compelling articles that show how licorice can act on both of those steps. Okay, so now on to step 3, which is called pigment transfer. Okay, so imagine you're this melanocyte, you've made all this pigment, and you want to share it with your buddies. You want to hand it out. You want to give it out in little packets to your surrounding friends in the skin called keratinocytes. So that is step 3 of the pigment production pathway. So if you've ever had a pen break, you probably remember seeing the ink, drop on a piece of fabric, and then that stain starts to spread. It starts to bleed in a bunch of different directions, and that's when the stain becomes really noticeable. And that's the same thing when it comes to this step 3, this pigment transfer step. And so that's, if we can really target that step as well, that's really a key component in blocking, that process that leads to these very obvious dark spots. It can really help with evening out the skin tone. Some of my favorite ingredients that block step 3 are listed here. And you're seeing licorice root again. And here it's because of a compound within licorice root called liquirtin. And that liquirtin has been shown to actually block that step 3, that pigment transfer step. Those are the 3 key steps when it comes to pigment creation. But once you have those stains, once you have those dark spots, then you want to think about lifting those spots off of the skin, basically sloughing them off, getting rid of them. So yes, you absolutely want to block steps 1, 2, 3, but you also want to think about adding ingredients and products that are going to speed what's called skin cell turnover. So if you imagine like the stains are there, they're formed, there are different layers of the skin. If you include ingredients like exfoliating acids or retinoids into your skincare routine, that's going to speed skin cell turnover. It's going to bring those stains to the surface so they can slough away, revealing bright, healthy, even looking skin. So it's really sort of that 1-2 punch, right? Blocking the 3 steps and then lifting away that pigment. Now, obviously, you have to be so careful when you're incorporating exfoliating serums and retinoids into your routine because both of those products are incredibly powerful, but they can also be irritating especially if you use them on the same night, right? So you want to just be mindful of building in recovery nights and going slow with those products. Now you guys are experts. You know how dark spots are created. You know how they're formed. You know how they spread. You know how to shed and lift away those dark stains. You know how to prevent new ones from forming. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And also comment below if you've tested any products for dark spots that you enjoyed or didn't enjoy. Share your experience. I always read the comments. And also let me know in the comments below if you want me to share a video on any kind of in-office treatments or procedures for dark spots. And absolutely don't forget to subscribe so that you can see the next video that I upload here. All right, guys, see you next time.